You are the only adult mammal on Earth that drinks milk, and you are drinking it from a species that would kill you if given the chance. This is not a poetic observation about human dominance or culinary adventure. It is a biological paradox so severe that for most of our species' existence, consuming animal milk after infancy was physically impossible. Your body is designed to shut down the machinery required to digest lactose the moment you stop nursing. Yet here you are, pouring a white fluid secreted by a 1,000-pound bovine onto your morning cereal. That fluid was never meant for you. Your ancestors lacked the genes to process it. And the entire global dairy industry exists because of a single genetic mutation that occurred roughly 7,000 years ago in a small group of desperate farmers who were otherwise starving to death. We did not domesticate the cow to get milk. We drank milk because we had already broken ourselves trying to survive without it, and the animal was simply the only calorie source left standing. Now let me show you how a digestive enzyme became the foundation of civilization, and why the glass in your hand is actually a monument to prehistoric desperation. To understand why this is strange, you have to forget everything you know about nutrition, and remember that milk is, biologically speaking, a private message. Every drop of milk produced by every mammal on the planet is a bespoke chemical signal intended for one specific recipient. A mother's body synthesizes proteins, fats, and sugars calibrated precisely to the developmental needs of her own offspring, and she produces it only while that offspring is actively nursing. When the infant weans, the mother stops producing, the infant stops needing, and the biological contract ends. For 99% of mammalian history, an adult drinking milk would be as nonsensical as an adult trying to breathe underwater. The enzyme responsible for breaking down lactose, called lactase, is expensive for the body to manufacture, so evolution ruthlessly switches off the gene that codes for it shortly after childhood. If you had told a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer that their descendants would one day build cathedrals funded by cheese exports, they would have assumed you were describing a fever dream. The real question is not why milk tastes good, but how a species that was genetically locked out of this food source managed to hack its own biology well enough to turn a toxic secretion into a staple crop. The answer begins not in a pasture, but in a clay pot buried under the floor of a mud brick house in Anatolia, 8,000 years before anyone wrote down a recipe. The people who first cracked this code did not call themselves farmers, and they certainly did not think of themselves as dairymen. They were transitional humans, caught in the agonizing centuries between hunting and settlement, living in villages like Çatalhöyük, where the walls were plastered over bull skulls, and the floors hid storage jars filled with fermented grain. These early Neolithic communities were perpetually hungry. They had traded the reliable protein of wild game for the uncertain yields of domesticated wheat and barley, and they were losing the bet. Grain stores rotted, crops failed, and the caloric deficit was constant. Somewhere in this landscape of nutritional anxiety, someone looked at the animals they had recently corralled, not for meat but for traction and manure, and noticed that the females were producing a liquid that mirrored the nutrient profile of human breast milk. The first person to taste raw cow or goat milk was likely a child, or perhaps a desperate adult testing whether the udder fluid could replace lost breast milk during a famine. And that first adult almost certainly got sick. Raw milk from non-human mammals is laden with pathogens, and even if it were sterile, the undigested lactose would have caused cramping, bloating, and diarrhea severe enough to worsen dehydration rather than cure it. But they kept trying anyway, because the alternative was starvation, and in that gap between biological incompatibility and nutritional necessity, something extraordinary happened. They invented processing. They had no word for fermentation, no concept of bacterial cultures, and no understanding of enzymatic activity, but they were doing it anyway. Archaeologists analyzing lipid residues on pottery shards from sites across modern-day Turkey and Poland have found traces of processed dairy fat dating back to at least 6,000 BCE. These were not traces of fresh milk, which spoils within hours in the heat. They were traces of yogurt, kefir, or primitive cheese. Someone had discovered through trial and error that must have involved considerable gastrointestinal suffering, that if you left milk in a warm container made from an animal's stomach, it separated into curds and whey. Someone else realized that if you churned the liquid vigorously, it transformed into a solid fat that lasted for months. These unnamed innovators were performing biochemistry without knowing what chemistry was. They were using bacteria as tiny machines to pre-digest the lactose that their own bodies could not handle, converting a poison into a provision. The stomach-lined vessel was not just a container, it was the world's first bioreactor, inoculated with rennet and microbial flora that broke down complex sugars into simpler compounds. A handful of curds wrapped in cloth decided who survived the winter and who didn't. This was not culinary refinement, it was survival technology, developed by people who were biologically wrong for the task, but too stubborn to die. And yet, even with fermentation, dairy remained a niche adaptation, a regional trick practiced by scattered communities on the margins of agriculture. It should have stayed there. The reason it didn't, the reason you can walk into any supermarket on any continent and find a refrigerated case full of liquid milk, is that a second revolution occurred inside the human genome itself, and it happened fast enough to reshape continents before anyone understood what was happening. Around 5,000 years ago, in the grasslands north of the Black Sea, a mutation appeared in the regulatory region of the lactase gene. Instead of switching off after weaning, the gene stayed active. Adults with this mutation could drink fresh milk without illness, extracting calories and hydration directly from the animal without the intermediate step of fermentation. The single nucleotide change conferred such an overwhelming survival advantage that natural selection amplified it with terrifying speed. In populations that adopted dairying, the frequency of lactase persistence jumped from near zero to over 70% in less than 200 generations, a blink of evolutionary time. People with the mutation were taller, healthier, and more fertile. They could extract 30% more calories from the same herd. They could survive droughts that killed grain-dependent neighbors. The gene spread not because milk tasted good, but because it was a portable, renewable, drought-proof calorie source in a world where climate instability was the norm. A single typo in DNA remade the demographic map of Europe, Africa, and eventually the Americas. But genes alone do not create industries, and biological capacity does not explain cultural obsession. Even after lactase persistence became common in some populations, milk faced centuries of resistance from societies that viewed it as disgusting, dangerous, or morally suspect. This is the part of the story that nobody tells you. For most of recorded history, drinking milk was considered barbaric. The Greeks and Romans, who built aqueducts and wrote philosophy, looked at the milk-drinking tribes to their north with open contempt. To them, milk was the beverage of savages who couldn't cultivate vines or press olives. Pliny the Elder described northern Europeans as subsisting on sour milk and butter, treating these foods as markers of uncivilized backwardness. Butter, in particular, was seen as a cosmetic ointment used by Gauls to grease their hair, not as something you ate. Meanwhile, in East Asia, where lactase persistence never emerged at significant frequencies, dairy was largely absent from cuisine for millennia. Chinese medical texts occasionally mentioned milk as a medicinal tonic for the elderly or infirm, but never as a daily food. Confucian scholars associated animal milking with nomadic pastoralists who lived beyond the civilized agricultural order. The resistance was not merely gustatory, it was civilizational. Milk marked the boundary between the settled and the wild, the cultured and the feral. This disgust persisted well into the modern era, and it took a combination of wartime logistics, industrial marketing, and government policy to overcome it. In 19th century America, fresh milk was widely regarded as unsafe. Urban dairies were filthy operations where cows stood knee-deep in manure and children died regularly from tuberculosis and brucellosis, transmitted through unpasteurized milk. The transformation of milk from suspect fluid to patriotic necessity required figures who were equal parts scientist, salesman, and propagandist. One of the most consequential was Harvey Wiley, the chemist who pushed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. But even more important were the unnamed home economists and extension agents who spent decades teaching rural women that milk was not just safe, but essential. They published pamphlets, held demonstrations at county fairs, and embedded dairy consumption into school lunch programs as a matter of national defense. During both world wars, governments framed milk drinking as a civic duty. Soldiers needed calcium for strong bones. Factory workers needed protein for endurance. Children needed vitamins for cognitive development. The messaging was relentless and remarkably effective. Within a single generation, milk went from being a questionable urban luxury to a symbol of wholesome American childhood. A carton of milk in a school cafeteria decided what patriotism looked like on a plate. The cultural revulsion didn't disappear because people suddenly liked the taste. It disappeared because institutions made abstention feel like negligence. Nowhere was this institutional coercion more visible or more absurd than in the mid-20th century campaigns that treated milk as a cure-all for problems it could not possibly solve. You have to understand the sheer confidence of this era. Nutrition science was young. Corporate interests were aligned with federal agencies, and the public trusted experts in ways that seem alien today. Advertisements featured doctors in white coats endorsing specific brands. Celebrities posed with milk mustaches. Government surpluses were dumped into school systems, regardless of actual student preference or tolerance. In the 1950s, the USDA literally paid schools to serve milk, creating a captive market that normalized consumption for millions of children whose bodies rejected it. This was not gentle encouragement. It was structural pressure applied to developing bodies. Teachers watched students drink. Trays were inspected. Children who couldn't tolerate milk learned to fake compliance or suffer silently. The campaign succeeded in making dairy ubiquitous, but it also created a generation of adults who associated milk with authority rather than pleasure, and whose gut distress was dismissed as personal failure rather than biological mismatch. A glass on a plastic tray decided whose discomfort counted and whose didn't. This is the legacy sitting in your refrigerator right now. A food that became universal, not through consensus, but through systematic normalization, carried forward by institutions that confused cultural preference with biological truth. Sit with that for a second. The discomfort you or someone you love may have felt after a bowl of ice cream was not a flaw in your body. It was your body correctly responding to a food it was never designed to process. And the shame attached to that response was manufactured by marketing departments and federal subsidies. I am not telling you to stop drinking milk. I am telling you that the guilt around intolerance is an artifact of industrial policy, not medical reality. The dark passage here is not violence in the traditional sense. It is the quiet erasure of biological difference in service of economic uniformity. Millions of children were taught that their bodies were wrong because a commodity needed a market. The scale of that misrecognition is invisible because it lives in memories of embarrassed silence at lunch tables, not in casualty statistics. But it is real, and it shaped the relationship between millions of people and their own digestion. But normalization was policy. The stomach aches were collateral. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it in every carton labeled as essential. Yet even as we reckon with that cost, the story does not end in critique, because the ingenuity that started this whole enterprise has not stopped evolving. The same creative desperation that led Neolithic farmers to ferment milk in stomach pouches is now driving new forms of adaptation that loop back to the beginning. Today, 65% of the global population remains lactose intolerant, and the market has responded not by abandoning dairy, but by reinventing it. Lactose-free milk uses commercial lactase enzymes to replicate the exact biochemical process that ancient herders stumbled upon accidentally. Plant-based alternatives mimic the emulsification properties of casein using nuts, oats, and legumes. Precision fermentation companies are now programming yeast to produce identical dairy proteins without involving any animal at all, creating molecularly indistinguishable cheese and yogurt through microbial factories that echo those first Neolithic bioreactors. We have come full circle, returning to microorganisms as our primary dairy producers, just as our ancestors did, but now with intentionality and control. The difference is that this time we understand the mechanism. We know which genes to edit, which enzymes to add, which microbes to cultivate. The wonder is not diminished by the knowledge, it is deepened. We are still hacking our way toward nourishment, still bending biology to meet need, still figuring out how to feed ourselves in a world that keeps changing faster than our genomes can adapt. And the facts keep getting stranger the closer you look. Consider that the ability to digest milk evolved independently at least 4 times in different human populations. Once in Europe, once in West Africa, once in East Africa, and once in the Arabian Peninsula, each time through a different mutation in the same gene region. Convergent evolution solving the same problem in parallel is rare enough in nature. In humans, it suggests that dairying exerted selective pressure stronger than almost any other dietary shift in our history. Or consider that milk composition varies dramatically between species in ways that reflect ecological strategy. Seal milk is 50% fat because pups must insulate against Arctic water within days of birth. Donkey milk is nearly sugar water, optimized for frequent nursing in arid environments. Human milk is relatively low in protein but rich in oligosaccharides that feed beneficial gut bacteria rather than the infant directly. Cow milk sits in the middle, balanced for steady growth in a temperate grazer. When you drink cow milk, you're consuming a growth formula calibrated for a calf that will reach 700 pounds in 18 months. Your body co-opts that signal for its own purposes, repurposing bovine developmental instructions for human maintenance. That repurposing is not trivial. It is a profound act of biological translation that your ancestors performed blindly, and that your body continues to negotiate every time you take a sip. Or consider the fraud. Dairy has always been adulterated because it is opaque, perishable, and valuable. Victorian milkmen watered down product and added chalk to restore whiteness. Modern supply chains battle melamine scandals and synthetic hormone controversies. The very qualities that make milk nutritionally dense, its protein content, its fat emulsion, its mineral richness, also make it an attractive target for deception. Testing methods evolve alongside cheating techniques in an endless arms race. Isotope analysis can now distinguish grass-fed from grain-fed butter. Mass spectrometry detects plant protein substitutes in cheese. Blockchain traceability tracks individual tankers from farm to processor. The infrastructure of trust required to sustain global dairy commerce is staggering, and it exists because milk is simultaneously too precious to waste and too easy to fake. Every certification label on a carton represents a failure that had to be engineered out of the system. The purity you expect is not natural. It is constructed, verified, and defended through continuous technological intervention. A seal on a bottle represents thousands of hours of analytical chemistry performed to guarantee that the white liquid inside is what it claims to be. And then there is the body itself, which remembers this history in ways that no textbook can capture. Lactase persistence is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. Some people produce enough enzyme to handle a splash in coffee, but not a full glass. Others lose tolerance gradually with age as gene expression declines. Gut microbiome composition modulates symptoms independently of host genetics. Certain bacterial communities can metabolize lactose, even when human enzymes fail. This means that tolerance is not fixed destiny, but dynamic negotiation between your genome, your microbial partners, and your recent dietary history. You can sometimes retrain your gut to handle dairy by reintroducing it slowly, allowing bacterial populations to shift. Your body retains plasticity that mirrors the adaptive flexibility of those first Neolithic experimenters. You are not passively accepting or rejecting milk. You are actively participating in a 10,000-year conversation between human biology and animal secretion. The glass in your hand is not just a beverage. It is a site of ongoing evolutionary dialogue, a living record of compromise and innovation that stretches back to that first uncertain sip taken by someone who had no idea what they were starting. Which brings us back to that mud brick house in Anatolia, 8,000 years ago, where someone lifted a clay jar from beneath the floor and found that the sour, separated contents were not spoiled, but transformed. They did not know they were inventing an industry. They did not know they were triggering a genetic revolution that would alter the trajectory of their species. They knew only that they were hungry, that the white liquid had changed, and that eating it did not hurt. That moment of discovery, tentative, accidental, born of necessity, is the true origin point of everything that follows. Every cheese cave in France, every dairy cooperative in Wisconsin, every precision fermentation lab in California. Every lactose-free carton in your grocery store descends from that single act of desperate curiosity. The person who first tasted fermented milk was not a pioneer in any heroic sense. They were simply refusing to starve, applying whatever intelligence they possessed to the materials at hand. Their genius was ordinary. Their courage was involuntary. And yet without them, none of this exists. Without that anonymous mouth testing that sour curd, there is no butter on your toast, no cream in your coffee, no ice cream melting on your tongue on a summer evening. The entire edifice of global dairy culture rests on that one quiet moment of trial and error in a dark room beneath a plastered floor. So when you pour milk tomorrow morning, remember that you are participating in a chain of improvisation that spans millennia. Remember that your ability to do so is neither guaranteed nor universal, but contingent on mutations, migrations, marketing campaigns, and microbial ecosystems that align differently for every person alive. Remember that the disgust and the devotion surrounding this food are both culturally constructed responses to a biological anomaly. Remember that the animal providing this liquid was never your partner in any sentimental sense. It was a resource extracted through force and maintained through infrastructure. And acknowledging that does not diminish the wonder, it grounds it. The strangeness of drinking another species' milk is not a problem to be solved or a guilt to be carried. It is a testament to human adaptability, to the willingness to try things that shouldn't work until they do. You are drinking impossibility. You are consuming a paradox that your ancestors earned through suffering, ingenuity, and luck. The glass holds all of it. The mutation, the microbe, the marketing, the memory. Drink it with eyes open, knowing exactly what it cost and what it means. If this journey through 10,000 years of lactose-fueled adaptation left you wanting to dig deeper into specific moments, here are 3 places to start. First, the Neolithic stomach pouch bioreactor. Go back to that moment in Anatolia where someone lined a clay vessel with the scraped interior of a slaughtered calf's stomach and poured in the day's milking, not knowing they were introducing rennet enzymes that would cleave casein proteins into curds. Picture the texture. Thick, faintly sour, the color of wet sand. Picture the smell. Sharp, animal, nothing like the pasteurized carton you grew up with. That person had no refrigeration, no pasteurization, no supply chain. They had a dead calf's digestive tract, an ambient temperature and time. And it worked. The lactose dropped to levels their bodies could actually process. The pathogens died in the acidic environment. The calories became accessible. If you want to understand where every wheel of Parmigiano, every wedge of chèvre, every tub of Greek yogurt traces its lineage, you trace it back to that pouch. Search for lipid residue analysis Neolithic pottery, and you will find the peer-reviewed papers confirming this, residue by residue, shard by shard. Second, the Victorian milk fraud wars. London, 1850s. A milkman named Thomas, whose surname history has mercifully forgotten, is adding water to his cans at a ratio of 1 part water to 3 parts milk, then stirring in powdered chalk and a pinch of sugar to restore the appearance of fat and sweetness. He is not alone. Parliamentary inquiries from this era document cases of milk diluted by 50%, colored with annatto to fake cream content, preserved with formaldehyde to prevent visible spoilage. Children in East London are dying from typhoid, transmitted through contaminated water used in the dilution. The fraud is so widespread that Parliament passes the Adulteration of Food Act in 1860, and enforcement is nearly impossible because the inspectors have no reliable chemical test. They carry lactometers, crude hydrometers that measure density, but a skilled adulterer can defeat them with a pinch of salt. If you want the absurd, the grotesque, the genuinely infuriating comedy of a city trying to regulate a white liquid that everyone needs and nobody trusts, that is your rabbit hole. Search for Victorian milk adulteration London and prepare to lose an afternoon. Third, the precision fermentation labs operating right now in California and Denmark. These are facilities where engineers have inserted the bovine casein gene into Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ordinary baker's yeast, and programmed it to excrete milk proteins identical at the molecular level to those produced by a Holstein cow. No animal is present, no udder is involved. The yeast ferments in steel tanks fed on sugar, and the output is whey and casein that your body cannot distinguish from the real thing. Companies like Perfect Day and New Culture are scaling this technology to commercial production. The cheese they produce melts, stretches, browns. The ice cream they make passes blind taste tests against dairy-based competitors. This is not a plant substitute. This is actual dairy protein manufactured through a microbial intermediary, closing the loop that began 8,000 years ago when someone first used bacteria to transform milk into something their body could tolerate. The microbe is back. The bioreactor is back. The only thing missing is the animal. And for the first time in 10 millennia, that might be optional. Search for precision fermentation dairy proteins and watch the technology demos. You will see a future that is also, somehow, a very old past. And if you watch those three things, the stomach pouch, the chalk water fraud, the yeast tank, you will see the same pattern repeating. Humans encounter a biological problem. They improvise a solution using whatever organisms and materials are at hand. The solution creates new problems. They improvise again. The cycle never resolves. It only accelerates. Milk is not a fixed object in this story. It is a negotiation, endlessly renegotiated, between human need and biological constraint, between institutional pressure and individual tolerance, between the animal that produces it and the market that distributes it. You are never just drinking milk. You are drinking the latest draft of a 10,000-year argument about what bodies owe each other and what they can extract without breaking. So here is where we land. You are the only adult mammal on Earth that drinks milk. You are drinking it from a species that would gore you, trample you, and stand on your chest if the fence came down. Your body was not built for this. Your ancestors were not built for this. The entire apparatus of tolerance you carry or fail to carry is a patch, a workaround, a mutation that spread because the alternative was worse. The glass in your hand is not natural. It is earned. It is the residue of 10,000 years of stubbornness, bacterial accident, genetic luck, governmental coercion, and industrial engineering, all compressed into a white liquid that still, after all this time, disagrees with most of the people who drink it. And yet, you pour it. You pour it over cereal, into coffee, down the throat of a child who grimaces and swallows because the cafeteria tray says so. You pour it because somewhere beneath the marketing and the subsidies and the mustache ads, there is still that original impulse, the refusal to let a calorie source go to waste, the insistence on trying the thing that shouldn't work until it does. The person in that mud brick house in Anatolia lifts the jar. The curd smells wrong. They taste it anyway. They do not get sick. They eat again the next day, and the day after that, and they teach their children, who teach their children, and the mutation catches, and the gene spreads. And 8,000 years later, you are standing in a kitchen in Ohio, or Osaka, or Lagos, holding a carton and wondering, vaguely, why this feels both ordinary and faintly insane. It feels insane because it is. It feels ordinary because 10,000 years of adaptation will do that. You are drinking impossibility. You always have been. The only thing that changed is that you forgot it was impossible. If this made you look at your refrigerator differently, hit subscribe. If it made you text someone the line about the calf's stomach and the clay pot, hit subscribe and send them the video. And if you are one of the 65% who cannot drink milk without consequences, this one is for you. Your body is not broken. Your body is correct. The 10,000-year experiment simply did not reach your lineage. And the shame you were taught to feel about that is a marketing artifact, not a medical fact. You owe the dairy aisle nothing. You owe your stomach an apology, and then a lactase tablet, and then maybe a small square of very good aged cheese, because the lactose is gone and the flavor remains, and you deserve to taste what all the fuss was about. I will see you next time. Bring your own cup.